China has been a nuclear power for over 50 years. Their first nuclear test occurred in 1964, so they've had that capability for a long time. However, unlike other large powers, they never built up a massive arsenal of nuclear bombs. Even today, Russia is estimated to have roughly 8,000 nuclear weapons, the US about 6,000, but China is still estimated to be around 300. That is 20 times less than the US. Because of this, China is often stated to be an example of minimum deterrence. That is, having the minimum amount of weapons necessary to still be able to frighten any enemy from attacking. However, satellite imagery recently showed that China just built 120 new nuclear missile silos in the middle of the desert in the past 6 months. With their current arsenal of just 100 ICBMs in total, this alone could more than double it. So, is that idea of Chinese minimum deterrence changing? Unfortunately, or maybe rather thankfully, you can't buy Chinese nuclear weapons from our sponsor. For that, Commando Store is not the place to go, but they do offer carefully graded military surplus that is functional, field-tested, and available in its native sizes. They also commission reproductions of gear that is no longer available, like the West German Polizei bomber jacket, the South African waxy boot, the Pattern 83 chest rig, and an assortment of all other cultural artifacts and accessories to match. With this kind of classical surplus drying up worldwide, Commando Store makes it a core objective to preserve the historical value and cultural significance of these era-defining artifacts, and to offer them at a higher quality level than the average dusty surplus warehouse. They always have new items coming in, so go, sign up for their mailing list. You'll get a few emails a month, often humorous, keeping you informed with the newest gear in stock. With it, you'll get 10% off your first order. Check the link down in the description below for directions on how to sign up. You don't have to walk into another Army-Navy surplus store just to spend hours digging through junk. Visit commandostore.com. The number of nuclear weapons just absolutely skyrocketed in the early Cold War, from just 100 in the early 1950s to 30,000 just 10 years later. It ultimately surpassed 70,000 at the end of the Cold War. This massive buildup also built up the anti-nuclear movement. Several large-scale protests took place advocating for nuclear disarmament. Eventually, treaties like START and the ending of the Cold War brought that number down from 70,000 to roughly 15,000 today. New technologies also enabled extremely accurate guidance systems. Now, just a single warhead could reliably hit a target, so it no longer required many more, less accurate missiles to ensure a hit. But it also brought about this idea of minimum deterrence. Again, that's having the smallest possible number of weapons, yet still having the ability to cause enough destruction to prevent any enemy from attacking. It's an idea that arms control advocates have always pushed for. That way, if there were to be a nuclear war, it wouldn't be quite as bad, but it would also lessen the risks of accidents, mistakes, and the possibility of nuclear theft. It also makes you look really good in the international community. If you have fewer nuclear weapons, that means you do not have the ability to launch a successful first strike and take out all your enemy's weapons before they can retaliate. So it goes a long way to prove that you would never start a nuclear war. Again, making yourself look like the good guy. The arms race that led to the 70,000+ bombs to be built was also extremely expensive. And while there are many reasons for the collapse of the Soviet Union, their inability to keep up with this nuclear arms race is often mentioned as being a major factor. China likely has seen this, and they see no reason to engage in a nuclear arms race themselves. The fact that nuclear war would be so devastating, regardless of whether you have 50 or 50,000 bombs, seems to have led China to instead build a solely defensive nuclear force, and spend that money instead on an offensive conventional force, which is honestly much more likely to actually be used. The key to having any defensive nuclear force is making it survivable, making it so an enemy couldn't destroy it all, or your ability to use it in a first strike. Like the US and Russia, China has built up a nuclear triad. They have a land-based nuclear force, sea-based, and air. However, the vast majority is on land. Each one of those have their own pros and cons. An air force using bombers to drop nuclear bombs or cruise missiles are often the most flexible, but they require air bases to operate from, they are slow, and they would have to approach or even fly directly over enemy territory. Sea-based using submarines can easily hide underwater, making targeting them very difficult, but it's extremely expensive and difficult to communicate with. Land-based is much cheaper, easier to control and communicate with, but it's the least flexible. This limited flexibility means you will need to come up with new ways to ensure that they can survive. The last video I made was about Tom Clancy, and what most people don't know about him is that before he was an author, before he wrote The Sum of All Fears, before Red Storm Rising, before The Hunt for Red October, he first wrote a paper published by the US Naval Institute for an idea on basing nuclear missiles. His concept was to mount a missile on a hovercraft, specifically the Navy's LCAC. The idea was to make it as mobile and flexible as possible to avoid being targeted and destroyed before it could launch. Hovercraft are pretty fast. They're able to move about 80 kilometers per hour, and they don't require any additional infrastructure like roads or rail lines. It can travel over any terrain, land, water, didn't matter, so it could be based out in the middle of the desert. At the time the paper was written, the big issue was how to base these new nuclear missiles in a way that would minimize risk of being destroyed in a first strike, but also do so securely, had minimal environmental impact, and low cost. While Clancy's idea of putting nuclear missiles on hovercraft may sound crazy, it really wasn't as crazy as some of the final concepts the US government came up with. In a since-declassified study, we see ideas such as tethering missiles to the ocean floor. They even drew a nice little image of a whale to show that it was extremely environmentally friendly. Or others, like having missiles stored and launched from barges that are randomly traveling down coastal and inland waterways, such as the Mississippi River, carried and launched from blimps, or from trucks driving down public roads, right alongside little Timmy and Susie as their parents are driving them to Disneyland. Despite all the concepts that have been developed, nothing beats just putting them in the ground in a silo. It's safe, secure, and the least expensive. It's not mobile, and therefore cannot avoid being targeted in a first strike, but that low cost means you can build so many of them that your enemy can't possibly target them all. Road mobile missiles that can be mounted and launched from trucks, like that Russia and China have built, in theory are great. They again can't be targeted once they disperse, and it saves money as you can house them all in one place until they need to disperse. But the problem is it relies very heavily on having an extremely good early warning system so you can get them ready and scatter them out before it's too late. When the US looked at this idea again in the 1980s, it determined it would need probably at least 2 hours of early notice to make sure they can get them ready and get them out. This is way too long in most scenarios. If a country decided to launch a nuclear sneak attack, their missiles would take less than an hour to reach you, and trying to get ahead of the game by dispersing your mobile missiles early in the times of increased tensions to prepare in case a war did break out could end up making things just worse, further destabilizing the situation. Your enemy would see you moving your missiles and might think that you are planning an attack, and therefore that they need to launch an attack themselves before it's too late for them. So it's a really delicate game, as nobody wants a nuclear war. Its effects are just way too severe, therefore you want to limit any possibility of a misunderstanding. So, getting back to those Chinese silos, it appears China has taken a similar approach to the US in basing these nuclear weapons, and that is having a large group of silos relatively close together for easy communication, control, security, and maintenance, yet spacing each silo out enough so that no one enemy warhead could destroy more than one silo. The US, for example, currently has 3 sites for Minuteman 3 ICBMs, one in Wyoming, North Dakota, and Montana. And if you look closer, you'll notice that each silo is at least 8 kilometers or 5 miles away from the next one. China's new silos are a bit closer together, around 3 kilometers between each, but this is likely still more than enough considering the trend toward lower yield nuclear weapons. Also, that buildup of over 100 silos doesn't necessarily mean that they are going to increase their nuclear arsenal. Not all silos will necessarily hold a missile. Going back to the US missile basing options, one plan called for the construction of 7,800 silos. Most of these would remain empty, but would give the enemy many more targets as they wouldn't know which ones contained an actual missile. So this could be the case for China. The DF-41 missile, which is almost certainly the missile to be deployed in these silos, is estimated to be able to carry up to 10 warheads, possibly 12. So if every single silo had a missile, that could mean up to 1,440 nuclear weapons, a massive increase over their estimated current arsenal of only 300. Or, instead, if only 1 out of each 10 silos actually held a missile, and each missile held fewer warheads than the maximum, as is often the case with US Trident and Minuteman missiles, the total number of warheads could be only 50, or even less. Those are 2 vastly different numbers. So it's hard to know if this implies that China is greatly expanding its nuclear arsenal without more information. An educated guess, though, would say no. China has instead been focusing on modernizing their nuclear force by making it more survivable and more accurate. And, as mentioned earlier, better accuracy means you don't need as large of a force. They've focused on building better missiles, particularly switching from the older liquid-fueled ones like the DF-4 and DF-5 to solid-fueled ones like the DF-31 and DF-41, which typically can be stored for longer periods of time, they're more stable, easier to handle, and more reliable. So they have a credible nuclear deterrent right now and one that's improving. And they've seen the results of an arms race, and can spend their money better focusing on a conventional military force, which we know they're doing as we constantly see and hear about it in the news. Odds are, in the next few years, their arsenal will grow somewhat, maybe adding 100 or more, but still nowhere near approaching that of Russia or the US.